One moment, Kimberly Guilfoyle was one of the most recognized voices on Fox News, a confident, commanding presence behind the anchor desk, captivating millions of Americans with her sharp analysis and unapologetic commentary. Her rise had been nothing short of meteoric, the kind of story you usually only see in movies. From a humble beginning in San Francisco, where she lost her mother to leukemia at the age of 11, she carved out a future most people only dream of. Her pain became her power, her grief the fire that fueled her ambition. She worked her way through law school, became a respected prosecutor in California, and eventually landed in the unforgiving world of television news. But where others faltered under the spotlight, Kimberly thrived. She didn't just report stories. She delivered them with a sense of urgency and passion that made people listen and remember her. By the time she joined Fox News in 2006, she was already battle-tested and camera-ready. And once she was on The Five, the transformation was complete. She was no longer just a contributor. She was a cornerstone of the network's daily programming. But television is an industry built on appearances. And behind every glittering on-air persona, there are layers the audience never sees. As Kimberly's star continued to rise, so did the scrutiny, the pressure, the politics behind the scenes. And then suddenly in July 2018, it was all gone. No farewell, no tribute. No thank you. Just a sterile sentence from Fox News. They had parted ways with Kimberly Guilfoyle. For a figure as prominent as she had become, the silence was deafening. It was as if the network wanted to erase her existence entirely, and they nearly succeeded. But silence rarely stays silent forever. To the public, the explanation for her departure was neat, almost too neat. The official story was that Kimberly had decided to leave television to support then-President Donald Trump's 2020 re-election campaign. She was, after all, dating Donald Trump Jr., and her Republican ties had grown increasingly public in recent years. On paper, it made sense. She was transitioning from media to politics, from news anchor to campaign surrogate, but something about the timing never quite added up. The announcement came more than 2 years before the 2020 election, unusually early for a campaign move of that magnitude. And the way she vanished, no on-air goodbye, no final show, no network acknowledgement of her years of contributions, stood in sharp contrast to how Fox had handled the exits of other high-profile figures like Bill O'Reilly or Megyn Kelly. Even in disgrace, they had received media send-offs, press coverage, and public reactions. Kimberly, on the other hand, was treated like someone who had simply disappeared into the ether. Behind the scenes, rumors were already beginning to swirl. Whispers about internal investigations, about legal complaints, about behavior that Fox executives reportedly didn't want coming to light. And then came the most telling sign of all. Kimberly herself stopped talking. This was a woman who had made a career out of being outspoken, unfiltered, and unafraid. But after her exit, her public presence shifted dramatically. Her social media became muted. Her statements were cautious and vague. There were no interviews addressing her departure, no fiery rebuttals, no demands for accountability. Just a fast pivot into the political arena, where she began appearing at Trump rallies and fundraising, events with an urgency that felt less like passion and more like a frantic attempt to change the narrative. It was as if she were sprinting ahead of a story that was gaining ground behind her. And Fox? They moved on without a second glance, continuing The Five as if Kimberly had never existed. No retrospective, no replacement announcement, just erasure. And in the world of media, that kind of vanishing act is rarely voluntary. It's almost always the result of something too messy, too damaging, or too explosive to say out loud. But eventually, the truth began to leak through the cracks. 2 years after her sudden disappearance from Fox News, the silence was finally broken. In October 2020, The New Yorker published a damning investigative report that revealed the real story, or at least the parts that Fox News hadn't buried, under non-disclosure agreements and closed-door settlements. At the center of the report was a former assistant who had worked closely with Kimberly during her final years at the network. What was supposed to be a dream job quickly spiraled into something far more disturbing. The assistant had filed a Confidential 42-page complaint alleging a pattern of deeply inappropriate and abusive behavior. Behavior that painted a far more troubling picture of the media personality viewers had come to know. The complaint described incidents that crossed every professional boundary. Allegedly, the assistant had been made to work in Kimberly's apartment while she was undressed. Exposed and indifferent to the discomfort it caused, there were claims that Kimberly frequently showed her photos of male genitalia, not by accident, but intentionally, and forced her to listen to stories of Kimberly's personal sexual experiences. It didn't stop at verbal harassment. The complaint alleged that Kimberly encouraged the assistant to engage in relationships with powerful men and demanded physical proximity during business trips, eliminating all privacy. These weren't one-off incidents. They were, according to the report, part of a consistent and degrading pattern of control, humiliation, and exploitation. And perhaps what made the story even more haunting was how long the assistant tried to handle it quietly. She went through internal channels, trying to resolve things without going public, without destroying careers. But as is often the case in corporate media, silence was favored over justice. It wasn't until long after Kimberly had already departed that the complaint surfaced publicly. By then, the network had already paid her millions to leave quietly, and Kimberly? She had rebuilt herself as a political powerhouse, aligning with one of the most polarizing families in modern American history. The scandal was buried under campaign speeches, media appearances, and fundraising tours. But for those who read between the lines, the picture was clear. Kimberly Guilfoyle hadn't left Fox News on her own terms. She had been pushed, paid, and silenced. And the legacy she left behind wasn't just about ratings or political loyalty. It was about how power, unchecked, can consume even those who appear untouchable, until they aren't single quotes de dot. According to the New Yorker's reporting, what had first seemed like an unexplained departure began to unravel into something far more troubling, far more deliberate. Kimberly Guilfoyle allegedly attempted to interfere with the internal investigation. An investigation Fox News had quietly launched behind closed doors in the summer of 2018. Sources claimed she even tried to offer money to her assistant, a young woman who had come forward with serious allegations, in an attempt to prevent her from cooperating with the legal team hired by the network. This wasn't handled internally by Fox's standard HR department. No, this situation was so sensitive, so potentially explosive, that the network brought in a prestigious outside law firm, experts in harassment and workplace misconduct cases, to handle it independently. The process took months. It was costly, comprehensive, and all-consuming, but to the public, not a word. While Kimberly was being investigated for conduct that could cripple the reputation of any media figure, Fox continued to push the idea that her exit had been clean, professional, and entirely voluntary. In reality, a different truth was being drafted behind glass doors and legal pads. And when the moment came to settle the matter, Fox didn't cut corners or delay. They paid, and they paid big. Over $4 million was allegedly given to the assistant, a figure so staggering it instantly reframed the narrative. That's not a settlement for a minor complaint. That's not hush money for a misunderstanding. That is the kind of financial silence that corporations deploy when the story behind the scenes is more damaging than anything the public could imagine. The agreement came with the expected gag orders, strict confidentiality, no interviews, no disclosures, no public record. Just the exchange of money and the enforcement of silence. What did that money really buy? It bought time. It bought Fox News the ability to distance itself from scandal, to maintain its programming without disruption, and to protect its brand from a firestorm it had seen consume other figures before. And while the assistant disappeared from public view, Kimberly Guilfoyle reemerged, not as a disgraced former host, but as a rising star in Republican politics, flanked by Donald Trump Jr., delivering speeches, raising millions, smiling from podiums and rally stages. The optics were clean. But behind that new career, there was a trail of questions no one dared ask out loud. As Kimberly stepped into this new political spotlight, something strange began to emerge, a kind of strategic Silence that felt unnatural for a woman who had built her entire brand on being bold, vocal, even confrontational. Whether she was facing off with liberal pundits on cable news or rallying conservative voters from the stage, Kimberly had always been loud, proud, and unfiltered. But not about this. When it came to her sudden and suspicious exit from Fox News, she became tight-lipped, evasive, almost rehearsed. In interviews, she gave vague responses, usually referring to new opportunities or her excitement about the 2020 campaign. She expressed gratitude for her time at the network, but never once addressed the elephant in the room, not the investigation, not the complaint, not even the abrupt nature of her departure. For someone who had never backed down from a fight, the refusal to engage with her past spoke volumes. And Fox, as if scripted by the same public relations manual, remained equally silent. There were no press releases acknowledging the controversy, no efforts to clarify or contextualize the settlement. Just business as usual. The 5 continued airing. Ratings stayed strong. And the network avoided the kind of cascading media meltdown it had suffered in the past with figures like Roger L. and Bill O'Reilly. The silence worked. It kept the scandal contained, kept the headlines brief, and allowed both Kimberly and the network to reframe their narratives on their own terms. But silence, while powerful, is also revealing. It becomes a vacuum where speculation thrives and truth suffocates. And for the assistant who had made the allegations, that silence was permanent. Despite receiving a life-changing settlement, she could never tell her story. Her voice, the very thing that might have explained everything, was locked away behind legal walls, reduced to a footnote in a story the public was never supposed to hear. When the New Yorker broke the story, in 2020, it wasn't just the allegations that shocked people. It was the realization of how far powerful institutions will go to bury the truth. Kimberly's team issued strong denials. She insisted she had never engaged in any kind of misconduct. But even then, even after the reporting surfaced, she refused to address the specifics. She didn't offer an alternative explanation for her departure. She didn't challenge the alleged timeline. She didn't explain why Fox News would hand over millions if nothing had truly happened. And for years, she kept up the act, the perfect image of political rebirth, carefully curated and emotionally impenetrable. Until she did single quotes it happened in a moment no one expected, a rare, unscripted confession that broke through the carefully crafted image Kimberly had maintained for years. At 55, during a private political gathering where journalists weren't supposed to be present, Kimberly finally let her guard down. She spoke freely. For once, she didn't recite talking points or pivot to politics. She told the truth, or at least a truth that had been buried under years of silence. "The scandal ruined me," she said, her voice quieter than anyone remembered it being. The admission was raw, devastating, and unmistakably human. It wasn't a prepared statement. It was a moment of emotional collapse from someone who had spent years projecting power, control, and resilience. And in those few words, everything changed. She described the pain of watching everything she had worked for evaporate overnight. The career, the status, the trust, all gone without a public trial, without a defense, without closure. It wasn't just the loss of a job, it was the loss of identity. Her name had become synonymous with controversy. Every achievement was now filtered through the lens of scandal. Every introduction carried an asterisk. Every interview came with unspoken judgment. She said it didn't matter how much she accomplished in politics. The shadow never left. It was always there, a quiet echo of the moment she was erased. And what stung the most? That she had given everything to that network, her loyalty, her talent, her best years, only to be discarded the moment she became inconvenient. No support. No second chances, just silence. That bitterness, buried beneath years of public smiles and campaign rallies, finally spilled out. She had survived, yes. She had reinvented herself. But part of her had never healed. And in that moment of brutal honesty, she gave voice to a larger truth, one that extends far beyond her own story. In the world of media and politics, reputations are fragile, power is conditional, and justice is often determined not by facts but by fear. One allegation, proven or not, can wipe away decades of work. Silence isn't just a consequence. It's a weapon. It protects the powerful. It buries the uncomfortable. And it leaves the rest of us wondering who gets to write the final version of the story. Kimberly Guilfoyle may still stand in the spotlight, but behind her there's a shadow that never fades, the echo of a scandal too costly to speak about and too dangerous to fully forget.